Welcome to episode 1 of the Lumberjack Lore Podcast, a place where we're going to share stories of wisdom, knowledge and tradition. And this is my first episode, so there may be some disfluency. I may occasionally look at my notes to keep me jogging along and try and emulate the template of what I'm going to try and achieve with guests that I bring along to talk to us about those things that really are encapsulated in the word craftsmanship, but also when I refer to the word lore in the term lumberjack lore, the spelling of that is L-O-R-E, and the definition of that word, as I just reach from my notes here, is that it's a noun, and it's by definition a body of wisdom, knowledge and tradition that is passed down from person to person by word of mouth. And so I want to, just as I launch this media, say that when I left high school at the age of 17 in 1985, I had only ever seen one computer. At that time in my last year of high school, the school that I was at purchased, I think, around about 12 of them. They did a big fundraising project to purchase those machines, and so I only got to glance through a classroom window and lay my eyes on one at that time. Little did I know that years and years later, leading into this, I'd be sitting in front of a camera, being able to try and create something memorable and special and of value to humanity that not me, but the people that I endeavor and invite on here to share their stories can share something that is of value and success, something that gives us joy and pleasure to listen to and that we can all learn from. In a word, as my life's evolved, education. That's my number one value today, which is something that I'd like to discuss with people that I bring on as well. So the purpose of it is really just aimed at connecting the links between physical fitness, creativity and productivity, exploring the potential to grow the Ivari platform, and you can see my brand behind me. Ivari encapsulated in 3 words: energy, drive and ambition. And now as a personal trainer, having pivoted in my 30s to this business, I can say what a pleasure that is now, having found that transition to be extremely difficult at that age in my life. So I've designed a framework of questions that I'd like to put to people that come on, and without trying to force the, let's say, agenda of the session, whether they be 20, 30, 60 or even an hour and a half long, just to kind of give me a guide, if you like, and more to be authentic, go with the flow as much as I possibly can. And every day I interact with several different people in my business, and I've trained over 13,000 individual one-on-one sessions. Every one of them, I can hand on heart say, has been different, but infinitely enjoyable, because really it's all about just being relatable and communicating and listening as much as possible, and just trying to kind of offer snippets of your own life experience and things that you've learned along the way in the context of keeping that conversation going. And mostly they're one-on-one, some small group, some team coaching sessions, but the one-on-one sessions are extremely unique and special in that in my business I have the unique and distinct pleasure of bringing the expertise and the equipment into the person's home. I'm an in-home training specialist. Continuing education has been a big part of the evolution of my business, And prior to becoming a personal trainer and coach, I was a lumberjack back in the central North Island Pumiceland forests of New Zealand. 20 years I spent in that industry, leaving school, as I said earlier on, at 17 and going straight into the family business with my father at that time, who ended up being involved in making a significant contribution to that business over a tenure of 44 years. And then in later years, having the privilege to not only work with my father, but also my brother. And we exited that business in the mid-2000s. And it was a time of upset, upheaval, tremendous stress and pressure. But we came out of it and endured. But we came out of it with fond memories and a lot of stories and a lot of crossover experience that we continue to use to this day. And there's several things that we and I are very proud of within the context of originally Wez Parkes Limited, which is my family name, and then Parkes Logging, as my brother and I became more involved in the financial and managerial and administrative side of the business alongside my mother, or our mother, and my sister. And they're skills that I use to this day, even in the personal training and small team and coaching realms. So I want to bring that experience to the party, so to speak, within the Lumberjack Lore Podcast, and try and extract a lot of what I see looking back on that 20 years in that industry as developing and honing a unique craft, and to be able to bring special people on here with those skills and talents and the craftsmanship, and try and extract what are some of the little tricks and hacks and things that they've learned along the way, what are some of the unique tools that they've had to use and or learn about and develop, who their mentors were, what they were taught and why, etc. So I come back to that opening statement of it just being about adages, beliefs, customs, fables, in that encapsulated in that word folklore. We'll hopefully hear some legendary stories from people that come on that are willing to share them, but particularly stories about craftsmanship. So as I say, as I get used to delivering this product, this part of my business, there may be what for some are awkward periods of silence. They won't be for me, just like in everyday life. Sometimes you just have to think, you have to gather your thoughts, and then you have to articulate them. And so in this episode, there's going to be a couple of those moments as I just try and present to you how I want to kind of evolve and deliver the product here. And as I say, without being too deliberate and off a prescribed set of questions, I really just want to go with the flow. And so in that, I have a mantra within the Avari business that when I'm one-on-one personal training people, and even with teams actually, where you have to be a little chameleonic, you can't be cookie cutter, the same for all people, everybody's different. I want the journey or the personal training session or coaching session to be educational. And it's not like I'm espousing myself as an expert in my field or a know-all. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, I'm just a human being, just trying to share in story form the journey of life with people. And as I've said earlier too, it's just so infinitely enjoyable. And as we try and escape, let's say, from the growing presence of social media in our lives, the spoken word, the interaction, the face-to-face with other human beings is just really so special to me and so yearned for, appreciated, And it's something I'm terribly grateful for, the opportunity in my business to be able to relate to people on that level, particularly in their own homes, which, as I've alluded to, is unique because you get to meet the extended family, you get involved even with the pets, and it's a very special arena to be involved in. And so really I want the podcast to emulate that. When we have someone on to share their story, I want people to be able to escape into it and really have a unique and special moment with that person who's come on to share that, and understand it and listen to it as a conversation, whether you're in the car, whether you're at the gym, you might be on a run, you might be just out on a walk, indulging in maybe some photography or whatever a hobby you have might be. Just listen to it and enjoy it for what one of my primary aims of it is as a human interaction and a conversation. So when I say that I want that journey to be educational, I'm just trying to really, with this as part of my mantra, connect the dots. So at the end of a session, whatever the syllabus of exercise may have been, for the person I've taken that journey with, for them to feel like they've had an education during that time, and that education's been of a quality enough that they could take that material away now on their own and execute it consistently and accurately. So in that capacity, with the experience, as I've said, in accumulated experience over the 55 years of my life now, I understand that in this job I work with the whole human body, mind and spirit. And it took me a long time to get to that sort of philosophy or realization, if you like, but that's definitely what it is. And as I alluded to earlier, some of those skills, or all of them, have been honed and developed over those years, ever since you're a baby or an infant, obviously, and there's a lot of research based on that. But as I said, I'm not a scientist nor a doctor. I'm just trying to share through the vehicle of conversation other people's experience of their evolution, of how it is they've got to where they are, what they actually do, and particularly how they do it. So body, mind and spirit's a big part of or going to be a big part of the discussion, and the way that I would try and steer the discussion and kind of the questioning that I might posit to try and allude to that. And so authentically, what I particularly want to share about in terms of craftsmanship is focus in on that period of 20 years where I was a lumberjack. And obviously, coming straight out of high school, I had a lot of tricks played on me by men that were way more experienced than I was at that particular time in that particular industry, and share with you that it was a terribly, terribly dangerous job, one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. And so one of the things my dad told me very early on was that just come in and do your best to be yourself, but listen. These guys that you're going to be working with know what they're doing, and so take notice of them, watch what they're doing, but most importantly, listen to what they're saying to you, because they're going to teach you skills that are necessary to, over many years, ultimately maybe be able to look upon yourself as a craftsman, but certainly in the interim term while you're learning it, keep you alive in this very, very dangerous industry. And so it was just such a distinct pleasure and a privilege when I look back on it, and I'm so grateful for it that I had many mentors over the years in many different contexts of that job. But initially we were in a primary producing industry on the front line. And while I'm thinking about this and trying to knit it in with the culture, let's say, of how I'd like this podcast to be, I don't want to alienate anybody, any minority group or any person, anyone at all through this platform. And by that I mean that while I was a lumberjack, I want to put in a little disclaimer that the forest that we all worked in was a man-planted forest. It was a forest farm. And so therefore, I just don't want to alienate or disqualify people, because I have to say, hand on heart, I love trees. I study trees. I have books on trees. And I value trees and forests and ecosystems and geology, geography, all of those things. But in this context, I want to just say that it was a man-planted forest, harvested on a sustainable yield, and we were part of a primary producing workforce that farmed that forest in the central North Island of New Zealand, as I said. So with that out of the way, I want to talk about some of the men that I worked with, and to get to the craftsmanship and the traditions and the folklore or the lumberjack lore, some of the tenets and rules and hacks and tricks that were passed down to me as I grew and evolved into that career, if you like, or that profession. And when I started in the mid-80s, it was probably one of New Zealand's top GDP producing primary industries. A lot of wood exported, a lot of wood put into the domestic market, and a lot of pulp and paper products were made out of what, the larger workforce throughout the nation that worked in that industry produced. And there were many characters, and without mentioning names, maybe and hopefully some of those guys will be listening to this down the line and realize that, in hearing what I'm going to share, that maybe it was them, and in a lot of cases it will be. Unfortunately, one of my really wonderful memories and mentors was deceased in his 50s, and I miss him, and I'll never forget that day that I found out he had passed, because I had worked with him day in, day out for many years. And when we talk about mentors, generally they're older, and just to kind of veer off on another tangent, just recently I've had an experience where I had several mentors, a group of mentors who were a little older than half my age. And to say that if I can look back on kind of mirroring the experience when I was young and looking at older mentors, now I'm probably a little bit older, looking back on people who are younger than me that can teach me just so much. So it can happen in reverse as well. And that recent experience is one that I feel is going to keep me young, because it was just so refreshing, learning so much in a new area that I knew nothing about, from young people that was so passionate and dedicated in terms of what they were doing at that time and what I was interacting with them on. And so that'll be a part of the platform as well, as that mentorship doesn't always have to be coming from people that are older, but there needs to be mutual respect. And so when I found out that this person of that was involved and had an impact on my life had passed, I was very upset. It happened around about the time that one of my grandfathers passed too, so it was a fairly rough time, and I was fairly young. But another important aspect of mentorship that I learned too was it not necessarily that he taught me always the right way. He wasn't necessarily the most accurate practitioner of, let's say, copybook practices, but he'd done it for so long that he knew the ins and outs of it. And so I, in some ways, learned from him a little bit of how not to do it. And just to background it, felling large trees, these trees ranged from like a ton in weight to 12 tons in weight, very tall, very wide in terms of diameter. and you're using very dangerous tools in a highly dynamic, noisy, almost kind of industrially violent environment, hostile, all weathers, large machinery, very dynamic, and working with a product that had an ultimate value, and therefore being one of the important things I'd like to emphasize in this discussion is a steward of not only the forest but the product that we were dealing with, and having respect for its value or its potential value. And what I feel we became, and when I say we, I obviously during those 20 years made several friends with colleagues and close friends of mine that worked in the industry, and can hand on heart say that we became stewards of the forest. We valued parts of that environment in a way that, I think lumberjacks could obviously around the world have a bad name for not taking care of their environment, when I believe the opposite was true. So we would undertake a practice called back pulling trees, where we would climb the tree and haul wire ropes up to fairly high levels and attach them to the tree, and then use a machine-based winch to, as we administered the felling cuts, back pull the tree away from water, away from buildings, infrastructure, so that we looked after parts of the environment that needn't be harmed, and that acknowledged longevity and cleanliness and high performance in an environmental sense. And so in so many ways we learned techniques that looked after that, rather than what I know the stereotypical view is of just kind of wrecking the environment. And there were elements of kind of having a visceral, let's say, view of that, where you would physically see a workover and come to that assumption, whereas there were specialist techniques that had gone on to mitigate and minimize the impact of what in the farm forestry sense was an essential industry. And so you'd see and hear a lot of different things going through your day, and at that time when I first started, there wasn't as much work pressure as what came on, let's say even a decade after that, when I had become nearly 30, and the industry and how we conducted our roles within it and our business within it had evolved and changed. So there were a lot of pranks and a lot of laughter, and for me early on when I was young, certainly a lot of teasing, and I have to say that even possibly more so, the spotlight was on me because I was the boss's son. And what I grew out of that was a healthy respect for a hierarchy, for the guys that I worked with, who at that age for me were big and burly and in some cases wild. But they led me and they took care of me. They took me, as the saying goes, under their wing, and they didn't want me to get hurt or worse. And so in a lot of ways I learned about pride, because I became, in a work sense, friends with these grown men who had been a group or a really high performing team for many, many years. And I immediately saw it, potentially because of the school that I went to, as a privilege, and not one to be frowned upon, but one to, as I am here, acknowledge and respect. In a word, respect is has a huge meaning for me when I think back about these guys and what they taught me. And there was so much to teach, but even more to learn. And in the environment that I talked about earlier, where I went into this small team recently with a group of really dear people and learnt about elements of an ultra marathon, I witnessed, and I may bring Michelle on at some point for an episode of the Lumberjack Lore Podcast, because what I experienced in witnessing what she achieved during that 6 days was one of the greatest things that I've ever seen in my life, and I have a lot of respect for that. And as I said, just learning from young people is huge. And so in that environment, I knew I was going in it to learn and not teach. And so, I talked, I didn't shut up. I tried to be sociable and I tried to be authentic, but I didn't try to be anything that I wasn't. And I knew I was out of my depth and drowning. And when I started in the logging industry, I was too. And I just don't think I had the perspective when I was 17 that I have now that I'm 55. And so I don't think I necessarily came across as cheeky. I certainly didn't try to, although I may have been looked upon as cheeky. But whatever these guys thought of me is none of my business. They thought enough of me to teach me the right way and to have me sitting here years later being able to tell the story, because there is a very high mortality rate in that industry, and that's something that I will bring through hopefully in this podcast, is my joy and admiration and gratitude for life. Because at times in a working day when you're a lumberjack, you could face that consciously once, twice, 6, 12, maybe 15 times. Unconsciously, things that happen that you might not have realized outside of those numbers that I've just given you. I don't know, maybe 30, 40, 50 times. And so what they taught and what was needed to learn was just vital to stay alive. And so there was a prescribed set of, let's say, rules, but a manual that was written that evolved into the New Zealand Qualifications Authority for Logging, which I was privileged to be a part of and came through, and it was very, very good. Governing body designed and mandated, but also government mandated, where it was compulsory to undertake it, and it was a great qualification not only to work on but to get. And then if we look at mentorship and being mentored in those early years and learning from these guys, and then learning enough to progress through that genuine and high quality system of qualifications and feel pride in those achievements that happened at a staged period of time in each facet of the job, and have a handshake with them and a well done and a pat on the back, which in that sort of industry, you didn't look out for. But if you got there and you got there honestly and you did the hard work, it was going to come your way. These guys were good in that respect and had a good, healthy approach to that type of acknowledgement, which I think was important. So as part of that, you had to demonstrate physically the elements of what these guys were teaching and then do your time. You couldn't go through the motions. You had to focus. You had to do it right every time. And the felling cuts were a vital part of that, and there were some, let's say, assessment techniques that you had to put into practice when not only you assessed the whole area of where you were working, but each individual piece of it that was right in front of your very eyes. And then to be able to cut an escape path to get out of the way as these giants of the forest fell for products down the line, and then to be able to guide machines in, haul by tug of war inch diameter wire rope up to 50, 60, 80, sometimes 100 meters downhill, uphill, sometimes a short distance, sometimes a long distance where you might need partners to help you, etc. So it was the ultimate team, and they were long days in all weathers. But it's very, very satisfying and interesting work. And one of the more interesting aspects of it was that you might be exposed to 6 different guys over the period of 2 weeks in different contexts of that role. Cross-cutting, which is tree felling; breaking out, which is hauling the ropes and stropping up the individual stems for what came in on the winch or the main line under the fair lead of the tracked or rubber-tired log hauler, which was known as a drag, and then that would come out to the landing where they would be, as in stem form, processed by grade into individual log and then sorted into stacks, by grade loaded onto trucks and then hauled out through the forestry roads to their destination, to their market. And there was an awful lot that went in it. So you got exposed to different teaching styles. And some guys would teach you maybe by yelling. Some guys would teach you just by instruction and then observation, and then let you go and keep a very close eye on you, but maybe let you make some mildly impactful mistakes and then point those out to you. Now, one of the greatest assets you could have in that industry, and this is where I really want to point the spear towards craftsmanship, which is where I want kind of to guide the people that I bring onto the podcast towards and share in specialist areas that they're involved in, which I think, from my perspective, having been a lumberjack, it's a very unique industry, but some of the fundamental principles of it cross over into every industry. And so within that industry, I want to talk about a very particular specialist niche skill which most jobs have, and that was how to sharpen a saw. And you hear in the fitness industry the term chop wood, and that very saying, sharpen the saw, is to say that mastering that made the job a lot easier, but that it took, in my opinion, probably 6 years to get really, really good at that. And you could get good at it, but mastery, or the understanding of being on the path towards it, took years to come. And Malcolm Gladwell's book, I can't think of the title of it, but he says 10,000 hours to become an expert in whatever that book is. And I agree with that in terms of being able to sharpen the saw. But then to lead on to that there were certain things that, as these guys taught me over the years, certain skills, in terms of sharpening, I had to learn that craft mostly on my own and evolve into some of the really little smarts that you learn by yourself, by studying it, weren't going to be shown to me because of my age. And so while these guys were prepared to share with me every single thing they knew about hooking up a drag really fast, where to place the choker so that the tree would roll a certain way when it was brought up under the fair lead of the extraction machine, where to place the felling cuts and why, how to understand the prevailing lean, which would come from light or a predominant wind, let's say, that the trees had grown that way because of that, and understand how to read and find out where to make a hole, which is where you start opening up your cutting face. And all of those sorts of knowledge were freely given and fairly given, and weren't even thought about by my mentors in terms of passing those bits of knowledge on, but they were not going to teach me how to sharpen a chain so that it would cut faster than them. And so that's a little pearl that I can share in the context of where I want this podcast to go and the understanding of the craftsmanship. Because once you learnt those little nuances for yourself and were able to use that highly dangerous, high performance tool, a big heavy chainsaw with a 2-3 foot bar on it, and have it cut, as we used to say in industry parlance, like a hot knife through butter, you had to learn that yourself, because they didn't want you to be doing that as a greenhorn, because then they may get showing up. So I remember, to share a story very early on, that I used to get timed through large cuts. So some of these trees would come out onto the landing. They could be 2 feet through, they could be 6 feet through, but you would be timed through a cut. These big, older than me, burly guys, strong, wild men would say, okay, well, there's a big one, man, we're gonna time you. And there'd be some ridicule coming out of that, because you couldn't sharpen the chain properly, and it could take you a long time to get through that cut. When they would come through and cut, let's say 5 meters down from it, where the diameter might be very similar, they'd get through it literally, as the saying goes, like a hot knife through butter, very, very quickly. And then your cut may be crooked because you sharpened one side more accurately than the other. So within that industry, that was the craftsmanship for me, was being able to hone that chain so that you could shave with it. And I got there, but as I said earlier on, it took me the whole 20 years. I was still learning aspects of that as we exited the industry. And then a lot of these guys obviously would share aspects of their personal lives with you, and they were sailors, and in New Zealand a lot of them were rugby players. They'd play bowls. They all had varied outside interests, and so locker room talk, or in the industry smoko room talk, was always about those hobbies and interests and their families and different things that they'd done in their lives. So it was high storytelling time, and hilarious, because there were raconteurs, and at times knew it, and fairly rough, expletive laden stories at times, but just so entertaining and balanced. And you'd see them, when it mattered, really focus in on being the important part of that team that they needed to be, and work on that particular part of the product, and ensure that when it was handed down the production line, that it got handed down with value added onto it. And so I learned that aspect of it as well, but also to value time outside of work, and be involved at times with some of these guys, and ending up playing sport with them in the context most particularly of rugby, but also being able to go sailing and see them outside of that environment, and give added weight to having the respect of seeing them and how happy they were in their private lives doing the things that they enjoyed doing outside of work, and meeting their families and getting to know their wives and their children. And so having value for that later on in life, particularly as you came to understand, let's say in a hard-working context, that work-life balance, but then also evolving from that also in terms of continuing education, to feel like that it was okay to go all in as well, because certainly in that industry, when you're the business owner or part of the business ownership group, it was 24/7. We worked 7 days, sometimes, not just daylight till dark, but daylight till 2 in the morning, or even at times all night. I remember working on breakdowns, trying to get machinery fixed all night. In one particular case, getting up off a tarpaulin under a machine that was in a gully, and the tarpaulin floating away on a small creek of water that was flowing under there due to torrential rain. And that was at, 11:30 at night, one night, going with the mechanic and getting the part and coming back and fitting it so that as daylight came, we had the machine going and we were able to go and keep the cogs of the machine turning. So it was hard work, and it placed, I think, us all well for being able to measure how enjoyable aspects of our personal lives were outside of that. And then also to understand that as my family exited the business and had to pivot and try and find our livings and eke our livings out and evolve and grow in other industries, that we had the horsepower to do it, because it took an awful lot. And when I say I pivoted career in my 30s, at that point it was hard, but looking back on it, I understand that I achieved it, but didn't immediately see it as achievable, and so fell into periods of inaction and inability to act. And having to work through that and graft and think and come up with innovations and ideas, and formulating my number one value, which I said at the beginning, being the value of education. And hopefully in the context of the podcast, just touch on personally here now what I would like people that come on the show to share as well, that during those periods I did some things that, if I look back over my shoulder, which I don't do too often, I may have some regret for, and friendships and relationships and actions that I took selfishly at times that I'm apologetic for. And so to really dig into that human element, that emotional element with people when they come on, to dig into or have a deep dive into, let's say, not negative things, but be able to be authentic and human, and say that if people are watching this that are thinking, look at this guy, he's just forged forward like he did back then and hasn't looked back with any reflection or, let's say, remorse or regret, well, that's not the show. And I've got to say that for people that I know that may follow and look and support this platform, is that if you're one of those people, I am sorry. But also to say that everyone that I've been fortunate to come into contact with in my life, I at times can remember and have the ability to reflect and be able to say with gratitude that it happened for a reason, or they were there in my life for a reason, that we come across people for a reason, and that we have an ability to adapt, assess, adapt and overcome, and acknowledge those parts of my life, to say that it hasn't been a perfect life and it never will be, and that life is chaotic. And even though we might want it to be smooth and plain sailing, that I want through this podcast for us to understand, with our interactions with the many very different people that may come on here, to help understand that very fact that that's not real. life is tough and life is chaotic, and it's how we front up to that. And certainly for me in my life, one of the things that I feel very appreciative for has been reflection and silent time. And I don't necessarily know if my personality is more bent to being an introvert, but I can say that I really enjoy time on my own and time to think, time to read, time to reflect, sometimes to do all of that in one sitting. Perhaps read a book, make some notes, and then reflect on those notes and try and learn and try and see if they sort of intersect with some of my own personal life experience. And so that's what I want to be interesting parts of these interactions, is when it gets into the weeds, and some of the people that come on will be friends of mine and people that have, you know, achieved great things in their life, but been part of my past, that I know and can say that I've borne witness to their journey, and that I'd like them to come in and share aspects of it, in the sense of what were the things they were taught by people, what position are they in now, and are they able to therefore pass on some of their own knowledge now to other people. What is their craft? What are the unique things that they've learnt? What is their number one value, for example? Are you a reader? Do you read electronically? Do you like books? Do you like Audible? Do you just like hearing books? And just to share those authentic life experience stories. So that's where I want it to go. Come and experience people's unique styles and personality traits, and get some little gems that we can take away and see if we can get people to learn or teach us how to implement them into what we're doing. And certainly I've been exposed to lots of different realms, and so what I'm aspiring to do is be able to bring in, let's say, some executive level people that work in construction, farmers, scientists, intellects, academics, people from all walks of life, and just try and have that really strong connection with them and ability to perhaps extract their stories from them, but communicate with them in a way that is really able to give them a vehicle to entertain you, that you'll listen to, and that maybe the old light bulb might go on here and there to say, wow, I really learned something there, and add value to your own life experience. And certainly with what you see behind me, I'm exposed to that every day, and as I've said, very fortunate to have come out of that lumberjack period of 20 years of my life and evolve into the health and fitness industry, and understand that fitness, I believe hand on heart, and I see examples of it every day, all day, every day, can be linked to increased productivity and creativity, and it can unblock you. It's not a form of escape. I think you need to study it, even if you're just going in for a 20-minute session or a 20-minute walk, which I call walking thinking, that you're going to come out of it with the solution to a problem. So what I'd also like to be able to do is try and extract those aspects of the philosophy of people's lives too, is are they able to prove that theory of mine by what they can and will say, and what has their experience been of trying to live a healthy and fitness oriented lifestyle, let's say. What advantages advantages have they seen coming into their own lives from striving to be like that? Because it's not easy, and you have to have an ability, just like what I know when I was a lumberjack, of getting out of bed every morning at 5 o'clock, sometimes earlier, and having the discipline to put your feet on the floor and go and try and make the best of every day, and understand that it wasn't always going to be a bed of roses. Sometimes you're going to get a kick in the teeth and you're going to get knocked down, but to understand and be inspired by knowing that that's everyone's life. And so listening to those get up stories, what knocked you down, what got you back up, who helped you, what did you learn along the way, what is your unique story, or what is one story you can tell us through Lumberjack Lore that can help us understand that it's all worth it, and that what we're all doing in our own lives is not unique to us, that every single person is doing it as well. And so that's where I want it to go. That's my first episode. As I said, it's cold and unfiltered, and even though you could see me reaching over to the laptop occasionally to look, and there were periods of silence in there, some kind of communication dysfunctions. I hope it outlines enough that you come back and listen to episode 2, and I don't know who that's going to be yet, but it'll be kind of like this format and conversational, and I'm really just hopeful from my own perspective that I can extract those stories by way of just being myself, and kind of having pointed but relevant questions, and extract these stories out that explain and document and record for posterity examples of our own humanity, which is just the most wonderful thing of all. So thank you once again from Lumberjack Lore Podcast, and we'll look forward to seeing you all on episode 2. See you soon.